Now I'm going to share my screen. Oh, wait a minute. Something. Oh, there we go. All right. So welcome to week 3 and module 6 on the United Nations. So first, any comments or questions on anything that we've done so far in the first 2 weeks? Nope. Okay. So this module, of course, is the first one that we've done with respect to international organizations. In this module, we will consider how the United Nations affects your industries, and what are the ways in which your industry deals with international enforcement initiatives of the UN, and what might be coming down the pike. So there are several ways that we will see that the UN acts and affects compliance people in the United States. In particular, we'll see that the UN is a forum and a host for conflict prevention and peacekeeping, and the fact that it codifies a broad array of transnational criminal issues. We'll also talk about some of the specialized UN agencies, such as the UN Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Program, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and through those 2 offices, the UN tries to foster effective implementation. The problem is that because there are so many small countries and even islands that participate in the UN, trying to get all of those countries to effectively implement all of the UN resolutions on nuclear proliferation financing, foreign terrorist fighters, drug control, transnational organized crime, crimes against the environment. A lot of countries just don't have the capacity to implement all of the many resolutions that come down from the Security Council and the General Assembly. And so therefore, the offices try to facilitate technical and financial assistance to developing states, and they try to help them design and construct effective regimes, whether it may be a model law on preventing and criminalizing terrorist financing, or what to do about foreign terrorist fighters that are about to travel, for instance, in the aftermath of the ISIS being taken down in Syria. But we also have seen that the UN has served as a forum for a lot of the conventions, the international conventions that we've already talked about, such as um, the Counterterrorism Financing Convention, the UN Palermo Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, the UN Convention Against Corruption. And so the UN conventions also have bodies. So for instance, the UNCAC, the UN Convention Against Corruption, has a body that monitors implementation. It suggests periodic revisions to that treaty. And then another important aspect of the UN is that the UN Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Program has developed model conventions and also model codes. So, I mean, one of the questions I ask sometimes on a final is, you are just starting to work for the mythical government of Waburenga, and the Attorney General says his country or her country has very few international criminal conventions, but it wants to start getting into preventing and being in a position to prosecute various types of international white-collar crime. You know, how can it do that? And it gives you the mission, the assignment of coming up with what its conventions should be. So, I mean, one of the things you can do is you can start with the UN model conventions on everything from mutual assistance, extradition, transfer of prisoners, transfer of proceedings, and so forth. If you also want a code or you want standards for your own country, again, the UN Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Program has done all kinds of model standards. So, and we also see that the UN Security Council is a source of authority on international criminal law. And it regularly adopts every year resolutions, especially that give guidance, especially with respect to the use of force and threats to peace and security. I mean, we know that they just met yesterday on the issue of the Ukraine. They are regularly making resolutions on things like conflict diamonds, which impact high-tech firms and where they can get the natural resources that they need for chips or for cell phones. There are also resolutions on transnational organized crime, on counterterrorism financing, and there are regularly resolutions on sanctions, which will be what we'll consider in Module 7. So, yeah. So a resolution may promote positive actions to prevent transnational crime. They may call, the resolution might call for countries to adopt laws to engage in asset freezing. So freezing assets, for instance, of terrorists who are on the UN list, so that the UN has its own list of terrorists, and the resolutions call for all of the countries of the UN to take action, things like to freeze their assets. And the UN gives through the UNODC or through the Office of Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, it helps weak and small states by giving them model legislation, by sending persons to help draft these laws, and so forth. So, one of the issues that the UN Security Council has been wrestling with for quite a while is sanctions with respect to North Korea. So, for instance, in December 22, 2017, there was a resolution adopted in response to North Korea's 6th nuclear test, prohibiting direct or indirect supply of crude oil, all petroleum products, food and agricultural products, machinery, and electrical equipment. And since a major source of revenue for North Korea are the fact that its nationals work overseas and they're required to send most of their money back to the North Korean government, the resolution requires those member states, UN members, to repatriate North Korean nationals no later than 24 months from the date of the resolution. And the resolution also calls for them, UN members, to seize, inspect, and freeze any vessel, or that's really impound any vessel in their port or territorial waters if UN members have reason to believe that the vessel is transporting items prohibited by the resolution. And member states are supposed to report to the UN on how it's implementing its sanctions. So they're supposed to report within 90 days and then periodically on concrete measures they've taken to implement the resolution. And more recently, since September, as many of you have probably noticed, since September of this year, North Korea has launched 6 more missiles just in the last month. The Biden administration has put 5 new individuals on the sanction list. 4 of them are in the PRC, and 1 is in Russia. The U.S. ambassador to the UN has called for new sanctions, but just in November, Russia and China proposed a resolution ending the existing, namely most of the 2017 sanctions against North Korea. So it only takes 1 permanent member of the Security Council to block a resolution. And so essentially, the Security Council is at a standstill in terms of adopting any new resolutions against North Korea. So as a result, it's, that the UN members just have to report on how they're implementing existing sanctions, And since it appears that China and Russia are not keen on implementing the UN sanctions, let alone the US unilateral sanctions, there are gaps in the ability to enforce either the UN or the US unilateral sanctions against North Korea. So, and it's important to note that the UN Security Council, it has 15 members, and the way that they implement a lot of their resolutions is through committees and working groups. So for instance, there's a counterterrorism committee that works to implement or to strengthen the ability of UN members to prevent terrorist acts, both within their borders and across regions. And it was established in the wake of the September 11, 2001 attacks in the US. And those resolutions require UN members to regularly report on how they are implementing these resolutions. And the committees have a staff of officials who, daily work communicating with the members on, how their implementation is going, whether they need any technical and financial assistance. And as you may recall, we mentioned in our module on anti-money laundering, counterterrorism, financial enforcement, that there are these FATF mutual evaluations. Either the mutual evaluations are by the Financial Action Task Force itself or by the FATF regional style bodies. And these evaluations look at whether countries are properly implementing the various UN counterterrorism and counterterrorism financing and nuclear proliferation financing resolutions. So when they, spend quite a bit of time investigating how these resolutions are being implemented in the various countries. There's also other sanctions committees in the UN Security Council, which looks at the way in which UN members are implementing the UN sanctions. There's also a working group established pursuant to Resolution 1566 of 2004 to examine practical measures to be imposed on individuals, groups, or entities involved or associated with terrorist activities other than those designated by the Al-Qaeda Taliban Sanctions Committee, and the possibility of establishing an international fund to compensate victims of terrorist acts and their families. So of course, there's all kinds of terrorist activities outside of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Whether you're talking about terrorist groups, for instance, in Colombia, Venezuela, there's still terrorist acts from time to time in Spain, and all over the world there are terrorist groups. There's a working group on children in armed conflict that looks to violations against children affected by armed conflict. And there's also a working group on international courts and tribunals. So that's how you see the Security Council very much engaged every day in making international criminal law, including international white-collar crime. So the UN Security Council has also been active with respect to ISIS. It has adopted measures with respect to measures to address returning and relocating foreign terrorists, fighters, and transnational terrorist groups. So, and so, for instance, it has used the passenger name record data, advanced passenger and biometrics to prevent terrorists from boarding airplanes, because, as we know, there have been attempts by some of the ISIS terrorists to use bombs placed in their shoes when they have boarded planes. The 2017 resolution has also strengthened judicial measures and international cooperation with respect to foreign terrorist fighters. It calls for ensuring appropriate prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of foreign terrorist fighters and their accompanying family members, and strengthening cooperation by UN members, including with the private sector, to protect public spaces and soft targets. I think, as we know, there have been a number of problems with respect to the foreign terrorist fighters returning to their home country, like the UK and Belgium, France, where they have, perpetrated terrorist incidents. The other problem, though, that has come to light really this week is the fact that many UN members have refused to take back their nationals or their permanent residents who left 10 years ago or so in order to join ISIS, including, some of the people that joined were basically women teenagers who, looked on the internet and thought it might be cool to, go to Syria for the adventure. And then, they've got caught up in the fighting. And so most countries have said they don't want to take back these people because of the national security risk in their countries, and also, the difficulty of reintegrating them. So you've got now prisons in Iraq, in the Kurdish area, that are overflowing. And in the last week, ISIS set off car bombs and succeeded in allowing some of the ISIS fighters that were detained to escape, although quite a few of them were caught. But the other problem that you have is Iraq just doesn't have the resources to properly adjudicate the thousands of people that are in these prisons. I mean, I guess they're not technically prisons, they're camps, because in addition to having the so-called terrorist fighters, there's a lot of women and children in there. And the children are now have been there, a lot of them have been there anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And so, I mean, another problem is just the terrorist threats of having all of these people, including a lot of young people, who now have known most of their lives these camps. And, you know, as you can imagine, the camps are overcrowded. They do not have facilities sufficient for proper education or even proper feeding people. And they're often controlled by the foreign terrorist fighters themselves. And so these camps are recipes for, you know, cultivating more terrorists in the future. So any comments or questions on this? Okay, so some of the activities of the UN Security Council have addressed the relationship between organized crime, especially transnational organized crime, and counterterrorism. So they've said that the resolution says that states should consider establishing appropriate laws and mechanisms for the broadest international cooperation, including joint investigation mechanisms and enhanced coordination of cross-border investigations. And they should explore ways to prevent radicalization in prison systems and promote rehabilitation and reintegration of convicted terrorists. So they found, for instance, in France, there's been a lot of, and also Belgium, there's been a lot of radicalization in the prison systems of some of these groups. So some of the, you know, foreign terrorist fighters that are in prisons, let's say in Western Europe, are radicalizing a number of the other prisoners. And so it's a, you know, catch-22. They're also, of course, doing it in the camps in the former, you know, Kurdistan in Iraq. The resolution also calls for advanced passenger information when any people on these lists are traveling. And it calls for FIUs to analyze financial intelligence of suspected activity of organized crimes. And it calls for states to consider potential effects of counterterrorism measures on exclusively humanitarian activities, including medical activities carried out by impartial humanitarian actors consistent with international humanitarian law. So in other words, the problem is while carrying out counterterrorism measures, states have to consider the impact of those measures on exclusively humanitarian activities. So if you've got a international NGO that's trying to deliver blankets or medical supplies to Syrian refugees, whether they're in Syria, Turkey, or Iraq, unless those supplies can be delivered, the refugees who are already in very dire circumstances are going to be exacerbated. And that also has already caused a lot of tension and even riots in places like Lebanon and Turkey, where there are huge communities of Syrian refugees. Um, so and it also, of course, has caused problems in places like Greece. I mean, in the other place where you've seen this problem has, of course, been in Belarus, where the Belarus government has encouraged foreign refugees to come to Belarus and then to cross over into Poland and Lithuania in order to try to seek asylum. And that's left a lot of refugees who basically spend their entire resources to get to Belarus, and then suddenly they're caught between Poland, which the immigration and customs officials are beating the refugees because they don't want them in their country, and so they're stuck between Poland and Belarus. So bottom line is the UN Security Council on a regular basis deals with all kinds of resolutions, and they make international white-collar crime. So there's also the UN General Assembly, which serves as a source of international law. It has very broad authority, and the resolutions it adopts can end up being a source of customary international law. For a resolution or something to be customary international law, there has to be consistent practice by a number of states with regard to a situation within the domain of international relations. The practice has to continue over a considerable period of time, and it must be required or consistent with law, and there must be general acquiescence in the practice by other states. So resolutions help to, basically set forth what the practice is. And so there might be a number of General Assembly resolutions on things like conflict diamonds or conflict minerals or counterterrorism financing or actions with regard to foreign terrorist fighters. So on April 3rd, 2017, the Secretary General submitted a report regarding UN global counterterrorism strategy. And it says the UN is tasked with three main functions: to provide a counterterrorism needs assessment and gap analysis, to help deliver capacity building and technical assistance, and that's done through the Counterterrorism Committee and through the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and also the UN Institute, International Criminal Justice Research Institute, and the UN also has to ensure coordination and coherence of counterterrorism efforts through the Counterterrorism Implementation Task Force. So also under the General Assembly is ECOSOC, the Economic and yeah, ECOSOC, which under which comes the specialized UN criminal justice work. So, and the General Assembly and these specialized UN criminal justice agencies then provide procedural mechanisms for the treaties, and they also do these model laws and model conventions. Especially a lot of these UN conventions that provide for sophisticated international white-collar crime mechanisms like asset forfeiture, civil asset forfeiture, administrative asset forfeiture, or value asset forfeiture when the proceeds of crime are no longer present because of the fact that the alleged criminal has moved the asset, but has other assets. So all of these various provisions in international conventions are sophisticated and nuanced, and a lot of the developing countries need assistance in both developing the legislation, developing the regulations, and implementing these tasks properly. So the General Assembly itself, has resolutions. And so it was a General Assembly resolution that created the UN Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Program. It also has created various UN criminal justice institutes, research institutes, which then they hold conferences, webinars, they conduct research on all of the latest problems in international criminal law, whether it be cybercrime, international environmental crimes, you name it. So, and then every 4 or 5 years, the Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Commission has a session which goes on for a couple of weeks. They organize it over a period of years in terms of they choose the topics, they choose experts to make reports on the topics, and then the experts will also, when they do the report, they will recommend model laws, model conventions, or ways to deal with whatever the new problems are. I mean, a lot of times they might be something like cybercrime, ransomware, whatever the crime du jour is. So then the Secretary General will report on promoting technical assistance and capacity building to strengthen national measures and international cooperation. So in the 2020, it was one of the main areas was cybercrime, and of course that continues to be an important issue, especially ransomware. If you look at the current issue of foreign affairs, there is a focus on cybercrime and how, until now, the U.S. efforts to combat cybercrime have not succeeded very well. The UN has been grappling with cybercrime. It also, in the 2020 meeting, transmitted the report of the Secretary General on capital punishment and implementing safeguards guaranteeing protection of the rights of those facing the death penalty. And that, of course, has been an issue in Texas, which still has the death penalty. And there have been various efforts. There have been a number of cases in the International Court of Justice brought by countries like Germany to obtain an order from the ICJ ordering the United States government to stop executions. My firm did a Supreme Court original petition, I should say, involving a German national who was about to be executed in Texas. The ICJ did issue an order, and the president at the time, President George W. Bush, tried to get the Texas state to stop the execution, but he failed. But anyway, capital punishment is one of the international human rights issues that the General Assembly is concerned with. And there's also Secretary General reports on the use and application of UN standards and norms in crime prevention and criminal justice. The 14th UN Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, this is one of the ones that's held every 4 or 5 years. That was postponed as a result of COVID-19. But you can also see on a YouTube video what the result of the UN Congresses has been from 1955 to 2020, because they just celebrated their 65th year of doing this in 2020. So, well, how do you think these model treaties or model rules, how can they be used? Are they just a bunch of hortatory stuff? Does anybody have any ideas of how you can use these model laws or model treaties in real life? I mean, I mentioned how a small country that wants to develop treaties can use these models to as a framework to negotiate with other countries. Or in addition, small countries can join the UN conventions. I mean, the UN Convention on everything from corruption, transnational organized crime, terrorist financing, prohibition on drug trafficking. By becoming a member of these various conventions, countries can then use them to demand assistance, whether it be evidence gathering, a joint investigation in order to find and try to seize, freeze, seize, and forfeit the proceeds of, let's say, kleptocracy, and so forth. So I was able, for instance, once I represented 2 Americans who were charged with murder in a small Caribbean country, St. Vincent. They couldn't get a trial for quite some time, and it was a husband and a wife, and both the men and the women's prison were from the mid 19th century, extremely overcrowded. What I did was I used a combination of the minimum rules, the UN minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, and I got reports from international bodies and civil society groups to show that St. Vincent was not even beginning to meet these rules. And I, on a regular basis, would communicate with the US Embassy, the consular officer in charge of the case, and would demand that the US consular official go to St. Vincent and demand that St. Vincent give these US nationals standards according to international treatment. So at one point, the woman had a serious health problem and needed some minor surgery to treat a problem that was getting worse. And finally, the government allowed her to leave the prison, for a hospital to have treatment. The rules, the standards can be used also, the code of conduct for law enforcement officials. So I also used that to say, look, you arrested my clients. They couldn't see a lawyer for a number of days. They were improperly detained, and they, weren't allowed food or drink for a certain period of time, etc. So so one can use these minimum standards then to try to call attention to wrongful conduct, and to try to get the foreign government to properly treat nationals from a certain country. So another mechanism that the UN has is the UN has a Committee on Human Rights. And the UN Committee on Human Rights is a place where an individual or somebody representing the individual can bring a case complaining that detention and or treatment in detention by of a certain person is contrary to international law. So this was used, for instance, by Mr. Razian, I think his name is Rezaian, who was a Washington Post reporter. He was both an Iranian and a U.S. national who was detained in Iran and kept for, I think it was 4 or 5, 6 years, and was kept in isolation, was mistreated. And so his family hired um, an excellent Washington law firm, which filed a petition with the UN Committee on Human Rights, and it got the committee to adjudicate that, yes, the treatment of Mr. Rezian was beneath international standards, and ordering Iran to either release him or provide the requisite treatment. Initially, Iran did not respond, but eventually Iran did release Mr. Rezian, and the going to the UN Committee on Human Rights is a way to call public attention to mistreatment and to try to exert pressure on countries to abide by international standards and their international obligations. So right now, the Committee on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice is about to hold on February 14 through 16 expert discussions on crimes that affect the environment. So, you know, in the context of the Kyoto resolution requires countries to take criminal action with respect to those crimes that affect the environment. And so the expert discussions will be held on those 3 days. The first one will talk about preventing crimes that affect the environment. So a lot of them will also talk about environmental justice and how, you know, how crimes, whether it's deforestation, wildlife trafficking, whatever, how they can be prevented. I mean, some of that also deals with education. The second day will be combating crimes that affect the environment. So, for instance, just in the last week or two, there was a report issued by an NGO in England called the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies. It published about a 65-page report on illegal wildlife trade and illicit finance in the UK. And essentially, it said that the UK was great about commenting on wildlife trafficking and financing of that crime outside of the UK, but inside the UK government was not doing nearly enough, and it provides all kinds of recommendations on how the UK can and should strengthen its use of authorities. I mean, the report basically said there's strong laws in the UK with respect to combating financing environmental crimes, financing wildlife trafficking, but that these laws were not being properly used. There wasn't a good national assessment of financing wildlife trafficking. And it called on the UK government to do more. So that's the type of discussion that will be held on February 15. And then on February 16, there will be a discussion of strengthening international cooperation to address crimes that affect the environment. So we'll be talking in the module on international environmental enforcement on things like the convention, the CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and the fact that the convention doesn't come with many mechanisms on implementation and enforcement, and therefore the international community has to be creative when it comes to implementing and enforcing CITES. So those are the various issues that the UN deals with. So bottom line is the UN is very active in terms of setting the agenda, making international crimes and even the procedures. And so you will see, that this will continue, and hopefully it will enable you to understand where some of these rules, whether it be international sanctions or mechanisms to prevent and resolve ransomware or other forms of cybercrime, where they're originating, and also to effectively operate in response to them. Another example is that the UN has dealt with the use of universal jurisdiction. And so that has come into play very recently as the German government has prosecuted a number of Syrians who have been allegedly involved in crimes against humanity. So with that, let me pause here and let me entertain any questions that anyone has, or any comments.
Hey, Professor, hello?
Yes.
I have a quick question on the questions for module for week 3. The second question is discuss how specialized UN criminal justice work contributes to the implementation of international white-collar crime. Should that be white-collar laws? The question, wrong?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could be laws. I mean, it could be crimes, laws, or even, solutions.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, you're very welcome. Any other comments or questions on anything? Oh, shoot. I'm not seeing the chat, so I noticed there are a number of comments. Yep, a lot of good comments by Ms. Cook. Yep. High State model. Okay. Sorry, when I had using the PowerPoints blocked me out from the chats, but thank you very much for all those comments. Any other final comments or questions on anything? Nope. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention, and see some of you then on Thursday.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.